I would like to present few slides, and believe me, I will not take more than 5 minutes. I understand we are running out of time. And I'm going to present only 3 slides in this era of heavy AI infographic. I'm going to present very simple slides. Most of the things are covered in our earlier session, that in sustainable agriculture in Indian context, how it is used. That's why I will not explain or elaborate it more. Then I will directly go to the why this need of transition is there. Then the already earlier panelist and Rahibai also explained us that how the natural capital like soil is getting deteriorated, and we need to take steps to what we can say improve this capital. And it is important because more than 40% population depends on agriculture in India, and for that purpose we need to restore this natural capital. Along with that, not only it is not associated with natural but produce human and social capital as well. And right now, what is the current narrative regarding sustainable agriculture? We think that it is less resource intensive. We would like to dig it further whether really it is resource intensive. One of our partner, landscape partner, Vasan, and Follow India's experience states some different story. We collected the data of 60 farmers along with this data is collected by Vasan team. Unfortunately, today Ms. Bhagya can't join to present this data. However, I'm taking this opportunity to glance through this data. It is, of course, first-hand data. And we collected the data from the bio inputs from the farmers who are preparing bio inputs by themselves on the farm, who are using chemicals for their farming. And another category also was there, that who purchased the bio inputs from the BRC or existing local market. However, there was no considered difference between the bio inputs prepared farmers and bio inputs purchased farmers. That's why we took these 2 categories only to analyze the data further. And what the result shows that why this data is that much important. As I said earlier, we said that sustainable agriculture is less resource intensive. However, what this 60 farmers data shows us that actually sustainable agriculture is not less resource intensive. There is data is showing actually it is expensive than chemical agriculture. Why it is expensive? We try to analyze the components with 2 different costs. That is, one is labor cost and another is input cost. Where is the striking difference for the labor? Interculture operations like weeding, pest management and harvesting require more labor in case of sustainable agriculture. Why it is required? Because in sustainable agriculture, we are shifting our focus from yield to net income from the particular farm area. And it promotes models like multi-cropping, which involves harvesting at multiple times, as well as spacing difference between crops is also different in such kind of models. That's why it becomes labor-consuming job, and it requires more labor than our conventional chemical farming. Another thing is for the input. Input also at the time of land preparation, farmer uses Ghanajivamrut, FYM, such kind of things, which is right now costlier than other chemical fertilizers. That's why it is showing some other aspects and expensive than our regular practice. The same thing about pest disease management, because pest disease management also it will means right now they are using the Shaparni Arc as well as biotheotonics. Such kind of things are not easily available market, and these are not incentivized in regular market. That's why it is costing more to the farmers. Overall, 38% difference is there between the costing. This figure may vary after having more sample size, after having increasing number of sample size. However, it gives our initial signal, this data gives initial signal that how it is resource consuming. And I would like to share this thought with this, and this panel means if it is resource consuming, then we are definitely requiring some additional resources for this transition at large scale. And our next panel will help us to understand how these resources can be managed. That was all from my side. Thank you.
The plenary, the inaugural plenary really set up the session in terms of, why, of course, we need to think about sustainable resource-efficient agriculture. It was really nice to hear from Ravi Bhai's sort of views on how, with seed, sort of procurement, how you're sustainably thinking about healthy food, nutritious food, and how can we do, and the different sort of, how some of those learnings can be scaled up as well. The big question that, of course, comes when, and Shweta, thanks for putting that out. While I think there's no doubt and there is a consensus that the way we're cultivating currently, the food being produced in India, I mean, it's not really working for us, right? It's leading to sort of impacts our poor soil health, of course, but also just the quality of food in terms of, the pesticides, chemicals that we are, and I think this was also something that was discussed a bit in the previous session. So we need to sort of think about a better transition, and Shweta's sort of, context setting slide put it quite nicely in terms of, if we're looking just in terms of the cost of doing the, production from a farmer's perspective, it's actually higher for sustainable or resource-efficient agriculture compared to the, traditional methods. So the question really is, how can financing play a role? What's the role of catalytic finance? And that's where philanthropy, but also how do we bring in more private capital, which can help in sort of supporting farmers to transition, and what would that sort of a mechanism potentially could look like? I'm really looking forward to some of those conversations around that, because we know that, I mean, it needs to be done, helps in agri-biodiversity, helps in sort of making us more sort of, from a human livelihoods perspective, it can eventually also lead to better incomes. But how do we do that? And one of the reports I was, sort of looking at, there's a Rockefeller and transformational investments in food systems and pollination report that came out last year, which actually talked about the gap that we are seeing in terms of transition. And they talk in context of regenerative agriculture. I'm not going to go into definitions here, but the gap is actually quite huge. It's about 200 billion to 450 billion for the next decade. So, I mean, if we just think about the numbers, we know that, while we all sort of agree that the transition needs to happen, how is sort of the question? And I'm looking forward to sort of discussing this. One of the other point, and I'll request all sort of, panelists to, while we are talking about finance, also the context is important, right? We are, I mean, 85% of farmers are small marginal landholders. Women still, only 13% own operational landholding titles. There is a lot of tenant farming. So when we are thinking of financing and transition, how would social inclusion sort of come in between in this sort of context in landscapes is also something that, I'd urge you all to sort of think about, because that's the context that we are working in, which, given this, I'll actually, Adeeth, first turn to you. In terms of, if we think just in terms of the overall costs and benefits or co-benefits of shifting to sustainable regenerative agriculture, that's clear. So, I mean, I don't want to spend time on that. But the question is, when we think about ecosystem services, right? I mean, are there payment of ecosystem service models which we can learn from, especially when we think about financing to sustainable agriculture? Are there couple of cases that you would like to share, just as a starting point to set this up here?
Thank you, Ruchika. Thank you for all the organizers for inviting me here. It's good to be here. It's an honor. Thank you for the questions. Regarding payment for ecosystem services, there are different forms it can take, right? One of the earlier panels said certification SIPs. That's also a form of payment for ecosystem services. In CIMMYT, we have been working or studying the carbon markets globally as well as in India, going to the farmers, surveys, case studies, etc. So we are in that space. And there are other forms of payment for ecosystem services, like there are some pilots in India as well, and there are other programs in countries like US, China, and other countries where, for example, in the US, government is spending around $1.5 billion every year to like conservation, payment for conservation. That's there. But in India, PES is not that greatly set up in terms of government participation. But after the Paris Agreement, there has been a lot of activity, private activity in the carbon market space, especially in the Afolu sector, as well as agriculture sector. So as of today, there are more than 126 agriculture land management projects in India, which are aiming to get carbon credits, right? One of the forms of PES. But what we have learned so far is the success rates have been very low. In India and generally globally, there are some examples in Kenya where agriculture land management projects have done well. And this year we had been to Kenya, we had done a survey of around 850 farmers to see what is the difference. In India, there are less than 5% of the projects have issued carbon credits, meaning less than 5% of the projects are actually paying farmers. We did a study a couple of years ago. During that time, none of the farmers have received money. So there are frameworks, there are standards, they are pretty good, private standards, where are Gold Standard, Plan Vivo, etc. So they literally tell what are the practices that has to be followed, what are the eligibility conditions, how to measure carbon sequestration or JJ emissions reduction, how to monitor, in what frequency it has to be monitored, and all of that. What I feel is we are falling short in terms of implementation of all of this. I'll stop here and
Thank
come
you.
back probably.
Maybe I can just follow up on what you just said.
Yeah.
5% in India is where the credit, carbon credits has been issued, and there are hurdles or bottlenecks. Can you elaborate why? I mean, it's been a bit so difficult in terms of implementation. A bit more, yeah.
Yeah. So there are again different levels of challenges. One is the accountability of the standards. For example, there are certain projects and project developers who are waiting from 4 to 5 years to get a decision from, say, Vera or Gold Standard. There is a process delay. And farmers have been onboarded 5 years ago. They're not being paid from 5 years. Farmers are waiting, and they're furious now. And this is from the administration point of view. But at the field, what's happening? We have done a survey, as I said, of around 850 farmers in India as well, and Kenya. If we compare, in Kenya, more than 90% of the farmers continue doing what they had adopted in carbon credit projects. In India, more than 25% disadopt from the second year. Why? Because one, payment is not there, the obvious reason. Second, there is yield penalty and the costs are increasing as presented previously. And farmers are not being educated and trained as much as they are doing in Kenya. In Kenya, 2 projects have been paying carbon credits money to the farmers, and more than 75% of the farmers have received money in 2 projects. But in India, we are still trying to find that project where farmers have received money. Farmer handholding, no payments are the major reasons, including yield penalty.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful to know. I mean, there's a gap in terms of capacity, essentially, at the implementation level when we're thinking about even unlocking, carbon credits, for instance, as an example, which brings me to you, Aparna. I mean, at the blended finance company, there's a lot more focus that, looking at blending finance is always complicated. We're really looking at how we bring different sources of capital together. Just in what you heard also from Adeeth, right? I mean, when we are talking about a transition to sustainable agriculture, we do need different sources of capital or blending. But at the forefront or on the ground are farmers and civil society organizations, a lot of them present in the room. They are the ones who are sort of doing this. How can they sort of use or deploy some of the blending finance mechanisms? How would that play out, just from initial thoughts on that?
Thank you, Ruchika, and thank you again. I think excellent panel that set the stage for us right before this. So very quickly, maybe I want to touch upon 2 or 3 points, and I'll illustrate it through some ongoing work that we are currently doing. I mean, there's obviously a lot of learnings that are still emerging from the ground. But one, maybe to answer your question on how can farmers and CSOs, a lot of who are in the room today, actually benefit from this. So it does take a lot of stakeholders to come together. I think Shweta's presentation was really telling. I think for a long time the narrative have been that if you switch to natural farming, the costs come down. While that may play out as you get more data or maybe over time as well. But initially there is a lot of transition finance that is required, right? And right now we're only talking about bio inputs. But the minute you start talking about maybe even adaptation-related assets, maybe something that helps with water conservation, like micro-irrigation, etc., the costs then sort of go up a lot more. And the flip side of this, I mean, when we are talking about 86% of farmers in India being smallholder farmers, etc., so there is today a lot of resistance because of perceived and potentially actual risks as well from the financial sector. They're not really lending to smallholder farmers, right? And while there are Kisan credit cards, etc., I think the uptake of that has been fairly sort of lukewarm. So one needs to think slightly differently. The way sort of microfinance came about. Can we start to look at maybe farmer producer organizations or other aggregation nodes? So under one of the facilities that we're setting up currently with the World Bank and with UNDP, it's in the design stage right now. We're actually looking at farmer producer organizations as well as village level entrepreneurs as aggregation points for smallholder farmers. Now, why that helps is it gives you the bargaining power. So everything from purchasing of these inputs becomes easier. Market linkages that the previous panel was also talking about becomes easier. But also they become conduits of finance, because as FPOs, as VLEs, access to finance becomes a lot easier. So that is what we're trying to set up to enable more affordable as well as provide more access to capital, which is specifically linked to sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture. I mean, I'm not getting into the terminologies, right? But the idea is that people should be able to access finance. And underneath that, there is an entire layer of capacity building, technical assistance, for farmer producer organizations. While we're talking about big numbers, like 40,000 FPOs today, the reality is probably less than 1,000 can actually absorb credit, right? And there is this journey that they need to walk from incubation to when they're actually credit ready. So there are fantastic organizations working on the ground that are supporting them with that. So whether it's governance, whether it's operational efficiency, how do you even fill out a DPR for a loan application? These are all inputs. And then how do you use CSA inputs, right? Even if they're available at the last mile. Is there a vendor that is available today? If I bought an equipment, is there somebody available to provide after-sales service? I think there is a mindset shift that also needs to happen from looking at farmers as beneficiaries to farmers as consumers and customers as well. That is really important, right? So building capacity, so we're bringing technical assistance providers. That typically comes from philanthropy, from CSR. It could also be through convergence of various government schemes. There is commercial capital today that is willing to lend to FPOs and VLEs, but however, realizing that there is a certain amount of risk, and so you need some amount of guarantee as well. Just till you prove out that lending for sustainable agriculture can actually be mainstreamed. So I think those are the different pieces, and that's how you really then take something like this to market, so that FPOs, VLEs, and then ultimately smallholder farmers can also benefit from that. So that's potentially one. The second, since you also talked about social inclusion, is, and maybe I'll add to what Adeeth has already mentioned. We are working with women smallholder farmers in northern Bihar, which is particularly harsh when it comes to the climatic zones there. So there is the Heifer International. They're an NGO that's been working there for many years. that has identified, what is sort of the list of 8 to 9 practices that will actually help women smallholder farmers transition to more sustainable agriculture. And as Adeeth rightly pointed out and Shweta's presentation pointed out, there is that transition finance that is needed. So what we're doing is we've actually designed an outcomes-based structure there to say, okay, fine, if and only if women sustainably transfer to climate smart agriculture. So that means that not only are they adopting it, but we're actually tracking retention over a period of 3 to 4 years as well. Only if you show those outcomes, will this NGO get their money back? And of course, there is an investor that provides the upfront capital first. So there is a way to structure this. But what this does, Ruchika, in response to your question, is ensures that the marginal farmers that we're talking about actually have access to transition finance. They see the economic value to at least transitioning, because without that, you provide support 1 year, you take it away next year, they will go back to doing what they. So they need to see that, and it's through demonstration plots, it's through peer-led models, farmer field schools, that all of that is being provided. So there is transition finance that supports them, and once you demonstrate that, then we are hoping from those 5,000 women farmers, this will then scale up to 25,000 and many more, because that's when you then demonstrate the power of something like that. So there are models around outcomes-based financing that we are doing as well. And here you can provide the unlock either from philanthropic capital, or as Adeeth was mentioning, you could tap into carbon markets. But of course there are delays that are currently happening. There is now the problem of carbon washing or greenwashing, and we've been coming under the scanner. When I say we, in India, we've been coming under the scanner. So you've got to work very, very closely with CSO organizations on the ground to make sure that they know what they're doing, they're following all the right processes, etc. And since you mentioned Rockefeller, we'd also done some initial work with them to think about how philanthropic capital can take on that risk in the early years, till carbon markets actually come and start providing capital to farmers. And once they see the economic value of transitioning in bits and pieces, we will see a much quicker uptake to sustainable agriculture.
Thanks, Aparna, for setting that up. I can already see a common theme emerging, right? I mean, when we were thinking about how blended finance mechanisms actually help farmers or civil society organizations, there's a lack of a capacity gap. And we need to think about capacity in obviously different ways. One is, maybe for the civil society organizations in terms of how some of these projects are, if they are partners with project developers, going to what Adeeth was saying, right? Sometimes they are also involved in some of these projects. How is the setup done? How are we setting up the monitoring mechanisms, etc., becomes crucial. But the more important point is the collectivization of, if we are working through farmer-producer organizations, and while there's impetus, and this is what we've also seen just in terms of, supporting farmer-producer organizations. One is the access to financing. How do you de-risk? And that's where first loss risks and some of these other, instruments become key. But there's a big gap also in capacity in terms of professionalization again of FPOs. can they actually run the business? How do we support them? And this would need different sources of financing. And I'll come back to on how, some of the models that, thanks for sharing the work in Bihar, because the outcome-based financing seems like one way to showcase till maybe the markets are ready to look at the other sort of aspects. But coming to you, Arpita, just in terms of, there's a lot on financing that's already happening, and role of sort of World Trade Organization sort of obviously becomes very critical, given Indian agriculture is heavily subsidized, and we are all aware. And if we just look at the WTA norms, a lot of it, require the red and, if we think about it, the red and amber box subsidies need to be closed in a particular time frame. And if we are thinking about repurposing chemical fertilizers to more sort of incentivizing through bio inputs, let's say, which Government of India is now sort of thinking of. A bit of it was also touched upon in the plenary when Dr. Gagnesh was sort of talking about incentives that are available. Do you think, how that would help in terms of help in moving to some of the green box from this, red and amber box, and a bit more thoughts on, just from a larger trade perspective, and because eventually this can link us to better markets. I think that's the larger question that was being discussed, right? How do we, one is production, but how we sort of then create the market infrastructure and access to more healthy food, yeah.
Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you very much for setting the context that, you just don't go organic, that organic is cheaper. Where you go organic is, and probably we all miss that point, is that you get a higher earning. Now, you have to enhance the earning potential of the farmer. And then if there is a higher cost, but there is a higher earning, you match it up. Now, what other countries are doing? If you look at the UK and others, they are actually providing subsidies for third-party certification and laboratory testing. And they are doing that for the 3 years of land rechange from a chemical to an organic. And they are doing that because once you change your land, your production falls. When your production falls, your earning falls. So you have to look at the earning potential of a farmer to engage the farmer continuously in whatever you may call carbon credit, organic, different types of organic. Now in India, let me first put on, there is no subsidy for third-party organic certification. Okay? And there is no subsidy for such testing. That is the first miss in the subsidy regime, which the entire world is giving. Second is that you are subsidizing PGS, which none of your developed country market acknowledges, and not only your developed country market acknowledges, even Arpita does not acknowledge for export. So if you are a PGS certified organic farmer, where 70% of the world, countries in the world actually takes PGS, your own export system is not allowing you to export. So look at the problem that you are getting a subsidy in a sector where you cannot earn income. You understand the problem. So it is about the subsidy regime to be changed. Now that is the first point. Second point is that, there are chemicals which have been, first of all, banned chemicals were easily available. So you ban the chemicals and monitor that the banned chemical is not easily available. Then you are subsidizing, and because in case of India, much of it is under the Ministry of Chemical, not in the control of the agriculture. If you look at the subsidy regime, it is like, 80% chemical and 20% bio. Whatever we may talk about sustainable agriculture, and we have around 52 policies related to that, the subsidy regime is totally on the other side. Next, when you talk about, when you go sustainable, what is the product? That is very important, and there is no common thought among the developed countries also on the product. Like US is talking about GMO crop, EU has banned GMO. So your markets, your two key markets are talking about different things. Now when you come to what is an amber subsidy, is that in case of agriculture, the entire subsidy concept is that you cannot subsidize for export. Okay, that is a prohibited subsidy. Here the export market is already rejecting these products. Your key export market like US and European Union on grounds of MRLs are rejecting the product. So, they cannot really talk about subsidies in this particular case. So and because the WTO dispute settlement is not working, there is a lack in the point of the WTO that you can really get challenged on the basis of the subsidies. So what is happening is that suppose if you heavily subsidize and then you heavily export, you can face a countervailing duty in your export market. That's the problem. But what you need to really focus on your export market is what the product, but in this particular case, we don't face that problem because that product is being rejected. If you look at our level of rejection in agricultural product, either by the USDA, they are not taking the product. So, you are not challenged. You will only challenge when they take the product. They are not taking the product. Now, in this particular case, what India should do? What we need to actually align our subsidy regime to the sustainable agriculture practice. So subsidies will be talked about if you are saving water, if you are reducing chemicals, now whether you call it PGS, natural, in the previous session I heard everything, but there is no definition of natural farming, and there is no definition of, how different it is from PGS and how different it is from organic. Now the most important thing is to help our farmers to move to third party organic. Because it cannot be that they are certifying themselves. They love each other, they certify each other. They don't love each other, they don't certify each other. So you move into a process where there is a third party auditing and certification process in place. To do that, your first point which he mentioned is very important, that you need to establish traceability for the farm. You see the rice sector and you ask them the question, we are doing a study, 80% has no traceability to the farm. So you have to then support maybe technological implementation to agree traceability, geotagging. Coffee board is doing that for coffee nowadays, but you have to first do the processes that leads to sustainability, and the first process that leads to sustainability is traceability to the farm. Second process is helping the farmer to access the right material at his doorstep. If there is a fantastic biofertilizer which is not in my doorstep, I am not going to use it. So how do you actually create a doorstep access process, then make it affordable and to the farmers, and once you make it affordable to the farmers are going to use anything that is cheap, good, with a long-term benefit. You have to look at farmers have to be trained with a long-term benefit, and that is that they are not going to make lot of profit in 3 to 5 years, and that's the point where the developed countries actually subsidize. They tell that, okay, first year, second year, third year, I'm going to subsidize you because of this reason, and from the third year onwards you should be on your own, and we need to design that kind of a subsidy regime.
Thanks, Arpita. I think very layered, you unpeel the onion, so to say, in terms of the complexity when we think about some of the trade issues, and very, very critical points when we are, just talking about subsidies. One, having a common framework or taxonomy is also sort of critical, right? While we are talking about natural farming, organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture, but what does it mean? And eventually are the products that are, what the kind of food we are growing, even for it to be exported, what certification? And there's a lot to sort of unpack here in terms of capacities, but seems like we really need to think about the repurposing of some of these perverse incentives, and how we think about subsidies itself needs a sort of rethinking, and maybe that's something, Jayari and fellow colleagues, we need to also think about how we take at the national level if we are really talking about it. The other sort of question, it's about when we say organic agriculture or sustainable agriculture or whichever, the accessibility and affordability is sort of a big sort of issue. It can't be just about premium sort of food pricing, right? How do we sort of make sure that that happens while some of these third-party subsidy sort of, third parties come in on how some of this works. But no, thank you so much. I think you've sort of really highlighted the complexity again, which I think Aparna and Adeeth also had sort of when we think about inclusion. I will ask you to, in the next round, talk about this in context from the smallholding farmers' perspective as well. If you could also, give another layer to that. But coming to Adeeth first, you touched upon initially in terms of, some of the challenges and how payment for ecosystem services or carbon sort of markets, etc., are not working. But there's a sort of a growing impetus in India now on a domestic carbon market. And in this background, what are you really seeing as sort of, challenges or disappointments? What is there, what can be done differently if we sort of move forward with some of those conversations? And if you could also nuance that a bit in terms of looking at, when this whole thing of carbon farming, would it really mean, when project developers are sort of looking at it, maybe from some of the CIMMYT's example of how you're looking at that as well, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The domestic or the Indian carbon market is planned to go live from 2026. So we are almost there. Because I think it was last month, there was an event organized by ADB and Ministry of Agriculture where the whole carbon market ecosystem people were there, project developers, certifiers, government, Ministry of Power, etc. So I think it will look very similar to the global voluntary carbon market or the private voluntary market that is there, and that's where agriculture carbon credits will be traded. So logistically, the processes, etc., all of that would remain the same, but then the costing or the prices would be different. The Indian market will be much cheaper for the project developers, and all of that. But there are a few lessons to be learned from the failures, if I may call it failures, from the global voluntary carbon markets for us. One, some of them I have already touched upon, the accountability of the standards. There must be timelines, right? So when you list a project, to audit of the project, verification, etc., there must be some stipulated timelines, like 3 to 6 months is the max for verification. Probably two more months for issuing carbon credits. The farmers or the project developers can't wait for years together to do that, because you can't keep investing all your money just to run the project for 5 years. That's not feasible. So that's there. And there are also some, because I felt I'm feeling very negative, there are positive side to the carbon markets as well. For example, in the past 2 months, at least 5 to 6 projects have been registered. And one project has already issued around 40,000 carbon credits in Karnataka. Coincidentally, it's an organic and natural farming kind of a project which is running in Karnataka. And they also have a agroforestry component to it. So that is registered and carbon credits have been issued. That's one. And there is an emerging frontier technology which is related to agriculture called biochar, where agriculture crop residues or agriculture industry processing waste are converted to biochar, kind of charcoal. So that is, there is market demand, and there are commitments from big players like Google with some of the project developers here that by 2030 they're going to buy around 1 lakh biochar credits from some of the project developers. And the prices are higher. Biochar 2025 average price is around $135 per ton, and for agriculture it was $8. So pricing is also an issue, and biochar, because it is a more permanent carbon removal technology than agriculture, soil, carbon sequestration. All of that is there. There's market demand. That's why the prices are high. And more than 50% biochar projects in India are issuing carbon credits. So there are positive sides of it. And for the domestic market, biochar is still not there. The methodologies have not been issued. The methodologies for sustainable water management in rice, for example, that's there for public consultation. Not all the methodologies or all the technologies are not yet there. So it's very, very early stages for domestic voluntary carbon markets. But CIMMYT's work, and there are other commentators as well, the lessons must be learned from the failures of the global market. And one thing, again, at the grassroots level is that in the projects which are running in India, we have done this in MP and Haryana. Large farmers from non-marginalized castes are enrolled. So there's an inclusion angle. We have a paper out as well. Only 5% of all of the participants are women. So there is a possibility of higher socioeconomic inclusions in the project. Probably that could be mandated or somehow incentivized in the domestic market. Probably, I'm just saying an example. If a project has more than 50% of marginalized caste households, the prices would be 5% higher or 10% higher or something like that. Some form of incentive to include all farmers from year one, not as an afterthought. And yeah, again, there was a discussion in the meeting of carbon credits last month. Should we also think of a minimum support price for carbon credits? Because $8 for a ton CO2 equivalent is not enough. We have done calculations. It must be minimum. Farmers should get around $25 to $45 per hectare. Only then farmers, the opportunity costs, yield penalties, costs, etc. would be covered. So for that, prices should be way higher, and agriculture land management projects are not fetching that prices, except a few projects here and there. So socioeconomic inclusion, incentivization for more socioeconomic inclusion, holding the standards or the registry accountable are some of the lessons that must be learned for the domestic voluntary carbon market to be successful.
Thanks for sharing that, Adeeth. I think very important, I mean, how do we sort of bring in more inclusion? I was wondering, I mean, you didn't touch upon it, but if it's $8, you know, that's getting to the farmers, is it because the project developers are taking more, or that's not the, because we've seen that in case of agroforestry and some of these projects, that also happens. The financing is going low, but that's not the reason why that's happening here.
Price is $8, and of the overall project developers probably take 20-25% of the revenue, and there are some other costs, probably 50-60% might reach farmers. 60% of $8.
Okay. Well, whether 60% or lesser, something to be determined. No, but thank you. I think you really sort of uncovered, when we're thinking about, as the domestic carbon market is starting to develop, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from, you know, how it's worked globally. But in the smallholder context of India, and you brought an important point, currently most of the projects that, I mean, it seems like the financing will still go to large farmers. And how do you set up the right governance structures or regulations? That seems like one big takeaway. If we also want to do it right, especially the small marginal, you know, high population in India, farmers. And how do we look at that? Which sort of, coming to you, Aparna, you touched upon initially in terms of transition finance, especially if we think about it, if we start thinking about a lot of this, eventually it's all work that's happening in landscapes, you know, based on agroecological principles, etc. How would a blended finance plan work in a particular landscape when we are thinking about aggregation in the small marginal landholding farmer context? Because you need a certain critical mass, right? I mean, if you're thinking about outcome-based financing, etc. Just if you could share a bit more sort of learnings in terms of, you know, how this could actually pan out with an example, maybe. I know you touched upon that earlier, but just, yeah.
No, thanks for that, Ruchika. I think so. There's a lot of obviously good research that's coming out, looking at, you know, different sort of climatic zones in India and how, you know, those then need to be financed. I don't think there is a particular sort of pathway or solution to saying, okay, this is, you know, what's going to work. Everyone's still experimenting with different approaches. The one that we're supporting currently is the one in northern Bihar, where HEFA, which is a international NGO that's been working there for decades, has a trust of the women, small and marginal farmers. Now, it's a very nuanced point, but I think it did sort of get covered in the previous panel as well, right? Because and Padam Shri Rohela ji sort of mentioned that as well. It's only when you have the voice and the trust of the smallholder farmers, can you stand in front of them and tell them, okay, try this approach or try something else. So the role of a CSO or a trusted organization that can work alongside the farmers becomes very, very important. Now, coming to the financing of this year, right? I mean, there's definitely a critical mass that is needed, right? So, put yourself in the shoes of an NBFC or a bank. They don't necessarily, even though there are PSL targets, and there are different ways, for them to kind of meet those through co-lending, etc. They're not really interested, if I put my hand up and say, okay, fine, there are 600 farmers here, which you could probably aggregate into say one FPO, that's not going to be exciting for them, right? Because then what ends up happening is that one decision that needs to get made at the regional level could take 8 to 9 months. You've already lost the agri cycle, you're probably looking at the other one. So the financing does not reach the farmer or the FPO when it is actually needed. So there is a need for actually making the loan products also match the agri cycle. So the cash flows need to sort of mimic that, which today isn't really happening. But that's one thing that we're also trying to bring in with the facility. But specifically on the transition finance, we are working in a particular zone because then that helps you get a critical mass. So here it's about 5,000 women farmers that we're working with. This does not involve commercial capital at the moment. This is still very experimental, where we are trying to show that at a certain cost, women are able to successfully transition and continue to adopt sustainable agriculture. Once that's there, I think, and this starts to happen at scale, is when you'll be able to bring in, say, commercial finance who can then fund them for transition, etc. It may not still happen at the smallholder level, which is why we're also in parallel trying the aggregation approach, which is through FPOs and through VLEs, because then the minute I'm talking about $45 to $50 million of financing going into FPOs, and this could be pan-India, right? It doesn't matter what I'm financing or where I'm financing, but if I go to a bank or an NBFC and say, okay, fine, we are looking at 200 or 250 FPOs, the quantum suddenly starts to look exciting. They're willing to work with you. They're willing to innovate on loan products with you as well, of course, with the right sort of risk mitigation. So that becomes, that scale, that quantum becomes very, very important. So right now what we're seeing, there's a lot of experimentation happening in small batch sizes, etc., which I think is fair because you need to arrive at the right pathway. But once you have that sort of pathway to scale, I think that is when commercial capital starts to get excited about this opportunity. Otherwise, it will always sort of remain bespoke and fairly sort of small. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I mean, we do have a long way to go, essentially, if we're trying to get more sort of, finance for the transition. But I think it's good to know that there's a lot of sort of these models that are being started out, and maybe there's a lot for us to learn in the next few years on terms of what works, and essentially then that will give us a bit more on the scaling piece, right? I mean,
absolutely. Maybe just one quick point, since we're talking about scale. At the end of the day, from a financing standpoint, right, what does commercial capital care about? That are there right market linkages, as Professor Arpita also mentioned, for the uptake? What is the price that they're commanding, and what is the probability of them being able to get that, right? So I mean, now with with climate disasters increasing in frequency as well as in intensity, insurance is another thing that we all need to think about as well. I mean, at least to a certain extent, things like parametric insurance that everyone's talking about, or index-based insurance could provide that right cover, as well as protect against yield losses, which are not really related to transition, but more towards climate disasters as well. Absolutely, right? Because if you lose out on a particular season, like what we've seen happen in Punjab this year with the floods, fields were wiped out, right, because of flooding. So you lose that entire crop, you lose seeds, etc. So having enough capital to tide over that then really becomes important as well. So not only looking at it from financing, sort of enabling the scale up of climate smart agriculture, but how do you actually improve resilience? I mean, if I can look at it through that lens, through products like insurance, etc. So that's another thing.
Thanks for sort of pointing that out. That was actually something which I wanted to unpack a bit more in the next round with you as well. We have to look at insurance, but also, sort of what kind of investments farmers are doing, right? And how do we sort of motivate them then for this transition to happen, especially in context of the climate impacts. And that's the critical one, which brings me back to you, Arpita. I know you touched a little on the whole WTO sort of norms and how that's kind of panning out, but we know that Government of India is currently a lot more focused in terms of setting up these bioresource centers and how that can help in incentivizing farmers for more natural or organic farming or regenerative agriculture, whatever the terminology we might use. So if you could sort of, you touched upon that a bit earlier, but just in terms of the larger sort of global process, how you think that could play in. And secondly, also, additionally on, now we know that in Europe and elsewhere, there's much more stringent environmental laws, UDR and others, that are really talking about sustainability. There's a lot more on measurement, etc. MRL you talked about earlier. So if one has to get finance from some of the flag sector companies, right, for sustainable agriculture investment, what would India, if one starts setting up production landscapes, or like, what Aparna was talking about earlier, we start thinking about what these models could look like. Just a bit more thoughts on what would we really need to get there then, yeah.
I think very important point, Ruchika, which I missed earlier, is that when you talk about sustainable agriculture and you go to a product which is sustainable, we need to have a product differentiation. The traditional models of HS code do not distinguish between a conventional product, an organic product, a greenhouse product. So many countries in the, like, Japan, US and others, they have kind of gone to a 10-digit or a 12-digit classification of the product varieties to go into product differentiation to actually talk about this is a sustainable product. So you have to, in India we don't have it still. We don't have a classification for organic. So that is your first step. Secondly, you asked me a question on small farms. If the farm is very small and the farmer is due diligently practicing organic, he still runs a risk, whether it is by flood or water flow or whatever, if the neighboring farm is conventional. So the method that the government first adopted to put a PGS or a system by getting small farms together to group them into a big farm, I think is a good idea. Where I'm critical of the process is that it should help PGS to become third party certified. You understand, that is the process where I think is lacking. Like if we have 20 lakh PGS, they should be 20 lakh third party certified. Then the commercialization happens. Then the Western world is interested. Now, given this scenario where developing countries are trying to bring in policies of the Western world, more so with the European Union, confused is America at this stage. So let's focus on the EU. When the European Union is designing a set of policies, it is moving into sustainability from an angle of environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, labor sustainability, the entire Green Deal concept. And for that, the first point which I mentioned is that you have to, whether you are a small farmer, large farmer, does not matter, there has to be traceability to the farm. So you reach the farm. Secondly, when you look at product wise, you identify the risk in the product. Each product does not have the same risk. So your risk in the maybe use of child labor in chili or child labor in the rice field with half the body soaked in water is a big risk. So when any institution is working with the farmers, they have to identify the risk, and within the risk what investments are needed. So if I am exporting, say, basmati rice to European Union, and if they are buying my basmati rice, it is almost said and done that I am not using tricyclosol because it is banned in the EU. So we are giving farmers a piecemeal information. Don't use this, don't do that, because then you cannot export. But we are not giving them a holistic information on good agricultural practice, which is going gap plus. India gap is very good. It is aligned with global gap. But the farmer is only getting a piecemeal information of the gap. He is not getting the full picture of the gap on the labor and environmental standards together. And he is also not getting the alternative. When I'm working with the farmers, they are saying IPT is banned in the US, tricyclosol is banned in the EU. So what should I use? I don't know. So we need to really think about that these are two products banned, but this is what you can use. That knowledge has to come. What is banned is always taught. The same problem is now if you go to any big tea company, they are saying this is banned, that is banned, I don't know what to use. Now, that what to use and what is my alternative is probably a training that can be provided to farmers. Water use and misuse and chemical in water is a very, very big problem. I don't know how to solve it. And the third problem that we always tell, use your own farm animal, use your own farm cow dung, etc. and that's organic. But you are feeding the animal wrong food. Okay, so if the cow is going all over Delhi and eating whatever possible, it is not an organic cow anymore. So that part has to be really thought through, that the animal food and feed has to be linked to the organic process, and that hasn't been thought through very well in India. And I think if there is something which gives this holistic approach, it is not that the farmer is always asking for subsidy, but sometimes they are asking for an holistic approach on the farm management technique all through. Like we are giving subsidies. If you have a farm, you have an animal, this, that, natural, you get a subsidy. But the guy doesn't know, after all of that, why is my market value so down? So that is where probably the investment should come. I strongly think that, if you have a PLI scheme in agri, food processing, link it to sustainable. You also spoke about any food processing incentives or any food supply chain related incentives which make value addition in the food product, forward linkages to the consumer. If it is linked to sustainability, I think sustainability will grow on its own. You don't need to do anything else. And once it is sustainable, commercialization will happen. If you look at the global demand is much higher than global supply of sustainable foods. So consumers globally are becoming aware. Of course, Indian consumers have to be aware, and that is probably a consumer can stop eating, but the consumer doesn't know which is chemical free and which. If you tell a consumer, look at this logo, look at this product, go at the back and read Jaivik logo, PGDS logo, NPOP logo, 5 logos. It is very difficult from the labeling perspective, it is very difficult from the consumer perspective. So from a consumer perspective, we need to make the consumer aware also, but Indian consumers are price sensitive. You need to think through that how do you make sustainable product affordable, and that is where probably a subsidy linked to sustainable product will make them affordable.
Thank you, Arpita. I think very important points, and all boils down to eventually, I think, capacity gaps. I mean, we are sort of putting a lot of onus on farmers that all of this needs to be done, but do they have the right support or resources is the issues that one also needs to look at. What kind of market infrastructure? How do we think about the entire regime and governance structures? With that, I mean, I think we can open up for a question or two, if anyone has any questions.
This is a very interesting question, and what we have been proposing to the government is that there has to be a system of evaluation first, because you need to see the genuine interest, ideas, thought process, and within the agri startup policies, there can be something which is more linked to sustainable and bio rather than any agri startup. You understand what I'm trying to say is that you link the incentives to sustainability is what the agri sector needs, and this is probably a very important area for subsidization.
Yeah, thank you. We can take only one more question. If you can introduce yourself as well. And if you can also keep it brief, please. Yeah, we're running late.
Hello. I am Dr. Shyam Vishwanath. I used to be the director of Kerala Forest Research Institute, Kerala. Mainly working in agroforestry. My question is specifically to Dr. Adeeth Cariappa. I was talking about carbon credits in agriculture sector and also biochar. Now, since 2018 with the National Bamboo Mission, a lot of farmers have started doing commercial bamboo plantations, and they are interested very much in what would be the kind of carbon credits. Has a methodology been worked out? I mean, there are others also, this consultant also, they can also maybe step in and tell me what is it that is there for the bamboo farmers across India?
Yes, thank you for the question. One important condition for carbon credits, any carbon credit project, is additionality, meaning something new has to be done. Additional carbon dioxide should be sequestered or saved or stored. So if those are or is applied back to the soil, biochar methodologies can be used. So there are a lot of standards and methodologies which are openly available for biochar. For example, there's a standard called CIMMYT International, and there's Puro Earth as well. Those are in high demands now. So you have a follow-up question? Yeah.
I just have a follow-up question. You said about it. So some of the plantations are raised for gasification, for generating electricity, and the byproduct is biochar. So that is okay.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the industrial biochar plants or the gasification plants you are saying, the byproduct is biochar. Biochar can be applied back to the soil, and the syngases can be used in electricity or whatever way. That is possible, and there are successful models in India as well. One in Hyderabad, which is using maize cobs in the gasification.
One is here in Gadak also, Karnataka. Gadak.
Thank you.
As a populous country, we have to meet the demand of the people always, and we have to keep it in this mind. And what policies should be implemented to maintain the supply chain and the economic prospects to shift from chemical to natural farming and for its sustainability? This is my simple question.
That is not a problem. And if you look at our exports, we are the world, fifth largest exporter. So we are exporting quite a bit. So your thought on food security is a bit outdated because we have been talking about it for 20 years. Now we are talking about nutrition security. So food, we are secure, but as you are moving also, India is also becoming high in terms of per capita income and others. So as you move from a high income group and as you have a large population, you need to look after the health of the population and you need to be nutrition secure, because otherwise it is a huge burden on the government. So the government has announced that we are moving from food security to nutrition security, and that's where the sustainability of agriculture, MRLs, these have adverse health impacts. So some of them has to be reduced, and that's where the focus is.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll have to close with this. And just as I was saying, 30 seconds, if there's one key takeaway when we think about financing for sustainable agriculture, what do you think? Could be just words, but...
I can go first. I think it's bringing together different stakeholders. We need a different capital stack. It's not going to be just commercial or just philanthropy or just government also for that matter. It needs to be coming together a different and creating that sort of capital stack that can allow for scale up of sustainable agriculture.
We have enough government schemes, but link budget to sustainability.
Focus on implementation at the ground level. Farmers first. Farmers are educated, trained. There will be carbon credits, sustainability, etc., and there will be linked payments. So farmer at the center.
Thank you. You've been a fantastic panel. I've enjoyed really talking with you, but I think I'm going to pass it back to Pallavi. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruchika. Thank you, panelists, very much. Small photo op. So I'll also request Shweta to join us on the stage.